Tale 1. The Whispering Hallway. It was a cold, foggy morning at Riverside High when the first incident occurred. The fog hung like a spectral curtain over the town, muffling sounds and creating an eerie silence. The students shuffled into the school, unaware of the terror that awaited them. By mid-morning, the loudspeaker crackled to life. Principal Adams' voice was calm but firm. "Teachers, please initiate lockdown procedures immediately. This is not a drill." Mrs. Thompson, the history teacher, quickly closed and locked the door, drawing the blinds and instructing her students to hide. The class settled into silence, the only sound the faint hum of the school's heating system. Suddenly, a soft whisper echoed through the room. At first, it was unintelligible, a mere murmur at the edge of perception, but it grew louder and more distinct, spreading like a chilling breeze. "Help us! They're coming! We're trapped!" Mrs. Thompson's face paled. The whispers seemed to be coming from the walls themselves. She tried to reassure the students, but the fear was palpable. One student, Emily, recognized the voice. It was her friend Sarah, who had disappeared 2 years ago. As the whispering grew louder, the lights flickered and then went out, plunging the room into darkness. A cold draft swept through the room, and the temperature plummeted. The whispers turned into screams. Emily couldn't stand it any longer. She bolted for the door, but Mrs. Thompson held her back. "It's not safe, Emily. We have to stay together." The door rattled violently, as if someone or something was trying to break in. The screams outside intensified, mixed with a grotesque gurgling noise. The students huddled together, trembling, as the door finally gave way. Instead of the expected intruder, a figure stumbled into the room. It was Sarah, her eyes wide with terror, her clothes tattered and bloodstained. "They're here!" she gasped before collapsing. The room plunged into chaos. Mrs. Thompson tried to maintain order, but the terror was overwhelming. Emily knelt beside Sarah, who whispered, "The shadow. They took us. Don't let them in." As Sarah's body went limp, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow darker and more solid. They stretched and twisted, reaching out with tendrils of darkness. The students screamed and scrambled away, but there was nowhere to hide. Just as the shadows closed in, the loudspeaker crackled again. "Lockdown over. Please proceed to the nearest exit in an orderly fashion." The shadows receded as quickly as they had appeared. The lights flickered back on, and the temperature returned to normal. But the terror remained. Sarah's body was gone, and the whispers had ceased. The students emerged from the classroom, dazed and traumatized. Emily looked around for any sign of Sarah, but she had vanished without a trace. The hallway was empty, and the fog outside had lifted, revealing a bright, sunny day. No one spoke of the incident again, but the whispers remained, haunting the halls of Riverside High. Tale 2. The Vanishing Students. Brookfield Middle School was known for its rigorous academics and strict discipline. The students were used to the occasional fire drill or lockdown practice. But on a stormy October afternoon, the lockdown was all too real. The sky had turned an ominous shade of gray, and thunder rumbled in the distance as Principal Lewis announced the lockdown. "Teachers, please secure your classrooms. This is not a drill." Mr. Anderson, the science teacher, quickly locked the door and directed his students to the designated hiding spots. The atmosphere was tense, the only sound the rain pelting against the windows. Suddenly, a high-pitched scream echoed from the hallway. The students exchanged fearful glances, and Mr. Anderson's face tightened with concern. He cautiously approached the door and peered through the small window. What he saw made his blood run cold. A group of students stood in the hallway, their faces blank and eyes glazed. They were standing in a perfect line, facing the lockers. Mr. Anderson recognized them. They were from his last period class. Before he could react, the students in his classroom began to act strangely. They stood up in unison, their movements stiff and mechanical. "Sit down," Mr. Anderson ordered, but his voice wavered. The students ignored him, their eyes blank and unfocused. They walked to the door and began to line up, just like the students in the hallway. Mr. Anderson tried to stop them, but an unseen force held him back. The loudspeaker crackled again. "This is Principal Lewis. Do not leave your classrooms. Remain where you are until further notice." Mr. Anderson felt a chill run down his spine. He turned back to his students, who were now standing in a perfect line, facing the door. Their expressions were vacant, their eyes devoid of any emotion. Suddenly, the door burst open, and Principal Lewis stepped in. But something was off. His movements were jerky, and his eyes were wide and unblinking. "Come with me," he said in a monotone voice. The students followed without hesitation, leaving Mr. Anderson alone and terrified. He tried to call for help, but his phone was dead, and the intercom was silent. The only sound was the relentless rain. Desperate, Mr. Anderson ventured into the hallway. It was empty, save for the line of students facing the lockers. He approached them cautiously, his heart pounding. As he reached out to touch one of them, they all turned in unison to face him. Their eyes were black voids, and their mouths opened in silent screams. The lights flickered, and the air grew colder. Mr. Anderson stumbled back, his mind racing with fear. Suddenly, the students vanished, leaving only the empty hallway and the echo of their silent screams. Mr. Anderson fled to his classroom, locking the door behind him. He waited in the dark, the sound of rain the only comfort. Hours later, the lockdown was lifted. The students returned to their classrooms as if nothing had happened, but the ones who had vanished were never seen again. No one spoke of the incident, and the school carried on as usual. But Mr. Anderson knew the truth. Something sinister lurked within the walls of Brookfield Middle School, and it had claimed its victims. He could still hear the silent screams echoing in the empty halls. Tale 3: The Haunted Library. At Oakwood High, the library was the oldest part of the building, with dark wooden shelves and dusty ancient books. It was a place of quiet study and whispered secrets, but one rainy afternoon, it became a place of terror. The lockdown was sudden and unexpected. "Teachers, secure your classrooms. This is not a drill." The librarian, Mrs. Hargrove, quickly locked the doors and ushered the students into the reading room. The students huddled together, their faces pale with fear. Mrs. Hargrove tried to calm them, but the tension was palpable. Suddenly, the lights flickered and the air grew colder. A low moan echoed through the library, sending shivers down everyone's spines. The students looked around, their eyes wide with terror. Mrs. Hargrove tried to reassure them, but her voice trembled. The moan grew louder, and the books on the shelves began to shake. A cold wind swept through the room, carrying the scent of decay. The students clung to each other, their fear turning to panic. Suddenly, a book flew off the shelf and landed at Mrs. Hargrove's feet. She picked it up, her hands trembling. It was an old leather-bound tome, its cover worn and faded. She opened it, revealing yellowed pages filled with strange symbols. As she read aloud, the symbols seemed to come to life, twisting and writhing on the page. The moan grew louder, turning into a chilling wail. The students screamed as the lights went out, plunging the room into darkness. A ghostly figure appeared, its eyes glowing with an eerie light. It floated towards Mrs. Hargrove, its mouth open in a silent scream. The air grew colder, and the wind howled through the library. Mrs. Hargrove dropped the book and backed away, her heart pounding. The figure reached out, its hand passing through her like a cold mist. She screamed as the figure dissolved into the air, leaving only a lingering chill. The lights flickered back on, and the room returned to normal. The students were shaken but unharmed. Mrs. Hargrove picked up the book, her hands still trembling. She knew she had unleashed something dark and powerful, something that had been trapped within the pages for centuries. The lockdown was lifted and the students were sent home, but the library was never the same. The books whispered secrets, and the air was always cold. Mrs. Hargrove knew the ghost was still there, waiting for the next unwitting victim to open its ancient, cursed tome. And so, Oakwood High carried on, its students and teachers oblivious to the dark presence that lurked within the library, waiting for the next rainy afternoon to strike.